At the end of the Second World War, many war criminals and former guards of the concentration camps were led towards gallows structures within occupied prisons and regions. Some of these executions were performed in public. For example, many female guards who worked inside of Stutthof alongside other officials of the camp were taken to a large hill in Gdansk where they were condemned on a large set of gallows in front of at least 20,000 people who watched on. There was inside of Soviet lands huge mass executions on gallows of German soldiers and senior members of the German army who were condemned in front of the huge crowds. But one method of execution which was used at the end of the Second World War was a variation of the gallows, and pole hanging was very different in the way it was performed, and there were some very senior politicians and also members of the Nazi Party and war criminals who were executed in this way. Welcome to The Untold Past. Today we look at the pole hanging executions of World War II, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Pole hanging was a different variation of what was known as a short drop method of execution or hanging. This method was developed inside of different European countries, and instead of using a gallows, it used a pole or a post to condemn someone. This execution method had many different steps in it, and it was known as the Vergelagen, or the strangling gallows, and this execution method looked rather brutal for those people who attended executions to watch. There was no dropping through a trapdoor into the abyss where someone would have their neck snapped behind the cover of a wooden platform or behind a curtain. This was all done in public. There were different steps with pole hanging. The first was where a condemned person was taken to their vertical pole or pillar, where they were then to be executed on, and usually a priest would accompany them during their final moments. The execution post was usually 3 meters tall, and there was a rope which was tied and attached around the feet of the victim. This was then passed through a pulley system, which was at the bottom of the pole. Following this, the victim was then forced into the air, dangling by a sling which ran across their chest, and they were then taken towards the top of the pole, and the chest sling held the condemned into place to ensure they did not slip. The rope was then passed through the hook at the top of the pole, and the noose was secured around the neck of the condemned. The sling was then released, and the executioner and his assistant worked together to bring the life of the condemned to an end. The executioner's assistant used a foot rope to guide the fall of the condemned, and the executioner usually was stood on the platform behind the pole, and he placed the heel of his hand under the jaw of the victim, and the force coupled with the fall on the neck allowed the executioner to manually dislocate the neck of the victim, and the head was forced to one side. As an execution method, it was considered by some to have been more humane than using the standard drop, as someone would often strangle for significant periods of time, and usually within a minute the condemned was killed. Sometimes even British executioners had to inject chloroform into the hearts of someone to aid the killing process, but inside of Czechoslovakia, pole hanging was used. It was also used in Hungary too, to execute some high-profile people at the end of the war. But during the Second World War, the execution method was not most frequently used inside of different countries, as lots of countries fell under German occupation, and the SS and other authorities such as the Gestapo tended to use the gallows or hang people involved in resistance from trees or any structure they could find. It was common inside different towns and cities to see many victims hanging from buildings also, especially following the occupation of these countries, such as Poland. Pole hanging was used more after the war as a method of executing war criminals. One prominent example of this was the execution of Ferenc Szalasi, who was the leader of the nation of Hungary during World War II for less than a year, and he was the leader of the pro-Nazi Arrow Cross Party. Szalasi was the head of government and state in the Nazi puppet government, and during his time in power there were huge deportations of people to the concentration camps, and his collection of militia regularly went around hunting victims and executed them. Despite his rule lasting only 163 days, he caused a huge amount of chaos and bloodshed across the nation, and he resumed the deportations to the concentration camps, and his actions resulted in much death. For his crimes, Szalasi was sentenced to death at the end of the war, and he was, on the 12th of March 1946, taken into Budapest for his pole hanging. He was executed alongside 2 of his former ministers and the former party ideologist of the Arrow Cross Party. The execution was condemned using pole hanging, and the large post had a rope attached to the hook at the top, and Szalasi was walked up to the steps. He placed his back to the post, and his arms and legs were tied, and then the noose was tightened around his neck, and the steps were removed. Szalasi actually died most probably due to slow strangulation, rather than being made unconscious at the time, and his execution did not go as well as it could have. There was one woman who was executed at the end of the Second World War, in the same place as him, on the very same posts, and this woman's execution was one which is shrouded in mystery. There has been evidence found that this woman who was executed by pole hanging was Maria Nagy, who may have worked inside the concentration camps, or she may have been responsible for large-scale looting of those who had suffered during the war. She must have done something to be sentenced to death, and this must have been a very serious offence, such as telling the German guards or Gestapo officials about the locations of those who were then deported to concentration camps. This woman was photographed before her execution, and her executioner was wearing a suit and a hat, as was his assistant. These two men condemned her, and on the pole next to her was someone who had been executed minutes before, and they had been covered with a white sheet. Andras Kun, a killer priest, was also executed via pole hanging. He led groups of death squads who carried out terrible slaughter. Kun's men massacred Jews and other civilians, and he would parade around the city in his priest robes, and he even wore his Roman collar, and he had his holstered pistol telling his men, "In the name of Christ, fire," as they executed people. His men carried out terrifying massacres on the banks of the Danube River, and he was then arrested and was sentenced to death. He was also executed using pole hanging, and on the 19th of September 1945 he was taken to the post, where the rope was secured around his body, and the executioner then took his life as crowds looked on through windows, and they clambered for a good view of the killer priest's execution. Kurt Daluege was a high-ranking member of the Nazi Party, and he was the chief of the Ordnungspolizei, or the Order Police, and he was also a deputy and acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was a senior police officer, and had 120,000 men at his disposal, and he carried out many terrifying reprisals in Czech lands following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. He was responsible for the massacre of Lidice, as the village was razed to the ground, and all the men were murdered, along with those inside the village of Ležáky. Many of the women and children were then sent to concentration camps. Daluege at the end of the war was captured by the British, and he was extradited to Czechoslovakia after dodging the Nuremberg trials. He was accused of crimes against humanity, and was condemned for this. And he claimed that he was loved by 3 million policemen, and he offered absolutely no remorse for his actions, and said that he just followed Hitler's orders. Inside the walls of Pankrak prison in Prague, Daluege was led out to the execution post, and a crowd gathered to witness his death and execution. He was executed using pole hanging, and within minutes of him entering the prison yard, he was dead. Also executed within the walls of Pankrak prison by pole hanging was Karl Hermann Frank, who was a Nazi official inside the Czech lands, and he was in command of the Nazi police inside the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and he oversaw the Gestapo, SD and the Kripo. His forces committed terrible crimes, including the roundup of thousands who were sent to concentration camps, and he was also involved in overseeing the massacres of Lidice and Ležáky alongside Kurt Daluege. He was one of the most senior officials in the country, and he conducted anti-partisan raids with thousands of his soldiers, and many civilians were executed by his men. At the end of the war, Frank was seized by American soldiers, was then extradited to the People's Court in Prague, and was sentenced to death. In front of 5,000 people, on the 22nd of May 1946, inside the prison courtyard, Frank was executed using pole hanging. So pole hanging was a different variation of the gallows that was used predominantly inside of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It was used for Nazi war criminals and those who collaborated with the Germans during the occupations, which resulted in such terrible suffering and death. As an execution method, it was something that appeared barbaric when crowds looked on, but it usually resulted in death quicker than if someone was hanged on a gallows in towns and cities. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.